Welcome to our posts. Today we will see stories of our /malicious compliance. Prepaid envelopes can be very expensive. So this happened over 30 years ago when I was 16 in the 1980s. In those days there were adverts in the press for a record club. This is actual physical albums, where you could get some albums free by signing up and then get sent 3 a month after that, which you had to pay for by a money order within 30 days or get charged interest. So I used it for a few months and it was okay, but then there was less and less good choices and I wanted to cancel the subscription. Each month I got the albums, I could return them in prepaid plastic envelopes, but for the first few months I kept the albums, so had a load of spare prepaid envelopes, important for later. When the quality of albums went down I just sent them back, but this was becoming a nuisance since it was getting close to when I was due to go to college and move away from home. I contacted the company to cancel the subscription, but that's when they nuked me by saying that I'd agreed a 36-month rolling contract from each agreed purchase. Waiting 3 years to get rid of this was not an option because I'd need to return every month to my parents to return the albums. I told them I was moving away. They were not interested, thinking they had me, and they did. They told me to send anything back I did not need each month and pay for what I kept, and they would start the ending of my contract from when I stopped buying albums. I made it clear I had stopped. Cue the malicious compliance. I thought about all the things I did not need, that I could send them apart from the garbage albums I was being sent each month. My dad did building work on the side of his main job, so we had hardcore and cement in abundance at the back of the house. So I got one of the first plastic prepaid envelopes and filled it with hardcore and wet cement, waiting for it to set. It was almost too heavy for me to carry to the post office, but I got it there. The company had to pay by weight for whatever was in the envelope, so it would have cost a lot. I phoned them 2 weeks after that. I mentioned I had quite a few envelopes and they wisely decided to cancel my account immediately. If it looks too good to be true, then it is. I learned that at 17. Next story. When China decided to crack down on Hong Kong's civil liberties and I as a citizen still had to pay my taxes to its oppressive government? No problem, I did it so that I actually made them lose money. Legally. Disclaimer, I have long since moved out of Hong Kong, so I guess I'm more or less safe now to share this story from a few years ago. TLDR. When the CCP started cracking down on civil liberties in Hong Kong, as a form of passive resistance, I took advantage of a loophole in electronic payment service while paying my taxes to make the CCP-controlled government actually lose money prior to deciding to emigrate. Anyway, much has been said about the Hong Kong protests of 2019-20, so I'll not elaborate further. In 2020, when the Chinese Communist Party, unable to control the public anger from the protests and increasing police brutality, decided to use the nuclear option of severely curtailing HK's autonomy and basic civil rights that was promised to its people when the city was handed over to China in 1997, that's when I decided it was time to leave. But in the meantime, a lot of preparation needed to be made for my exit strategy. I was still in a job and still had to pay my taxes. And there was COVID, which further delayed my departure by a few years. Before I finally emigrated, sometime last year, I needed to maintain as low a profile as possible so me and my family could escape from there safely, so tax evasion was a no-no, as much as I no longer wanted to pay my taxes to pay for the salaries of the intransigent officials that were upping the ante and oppressing my fellow citizens. Instead, I discovered you could pay taxes electronically using an electronic payment service to pay for almost anything, including taxes. You could pay for stuff via mobile phone or on the internet. For every transaction made, the vendor will be charged $2 by the service company. If you're paying taxes, the vendor would be the government. Now notice here that they did not state a minimum amount for every transaction. Meaning that if I pay $1 and the payment service charges the government $2 per transaction, the government ends up making a net loss of -$1. If I do it multiple times, the CCP government will lose a lot of money. And the fun thing about that, at least when I did it, it was perfectly legal. Though the main catch was that the service only lets you do up to 50 transactions a day, amounting to $50. The CCP government will still lose $100. But that was not going to stop me from sticking the finger to the CCP. So I diligently paid my taxes, dollar by dollar, day by day, using that electronic payment system. I made sure to set aside about half an hour every day after coming home from work, so I could perform 50 transactions for that day. I lost count of how many months it took for me to completely clear my taxes for that year using this passive-aggressive method, and I fully realized the small resistance would barely dent the CCP government's coffers. At least I sleep in the knowledge that the taxes they used to oppress my fellow Hong Kongers will not have come from me, as I refuse to pay the CCP a single penny anymore. Next story. Stack the pallets 4 high. I used to work as a merchandiser for a national soda company about 10 years ago. One of the biggest problems we had would occur every holiday when stores had serious sales on soda, like getting 4 12-packs for $10. The problem is that there simply isn't enough room in the backroom to store enough product on a really busy holiday like the 4th of July. Our sales reps would order way more stuff than we ever had room for, and then it was up to me on how to Tetris it all into the space for us in the back. The way it should be done is to send multiple orders on days like that as space becomes available, but of course that means sending drivers to stores multiple times, which costs time and gas. I had one store that had a really strict backroom manager with a no exceptions policy of pallets never being stacked more than 3 high. On this particular 4th of July, we literally had twice as much product than what would fit. So I call my boss and tell him he needs to send a driver to buy back some of the excess load. He tells me to stack the pallets as high as the forklift will allow me to solve the problem. I remind him at this location I'm only allowed to stack 3 high. He tells me to figure it out. Cue malicious compliance. I know that the backroom manager will get lava level mad when he sees this, but it's the boss orders, so I am up to 5 high when the manager sees it and goes banshee apes hit on me. I tell him it's my boss orders. I finish stacking, with one tower now being 5 high, then start walking out as my shift is now done. The backroom manager tells me if I leave it like that we can kiss our account with the store goodbye. I man shrugging and leave. I get a call from my boss 30 minutes later that there is a driver on the way to do buyback and I need to go back to that store as soon as possible. I tell him my shift is done for the day and I have already returned the company truck and am on my way home to see some fireworks. It's 8 p.m. at this point. He tells me to turn around and go get it sorted. I tell him the only way I am going back is if I get double time for the entire day, about 14 hours at that point, plus a 10% raise. He yells at me that it's never going to happen, so I tell him that me returning to the store is never going to happen. I also tell him that if he changes his mind he can send an email to me agreeing in writing to my terms. I had other side gigs at the time and wasn't concerned at all about this job. I got an email 30 minutes later from my boss's boss agreeing to those terms. It is immediately followed by a phone call from him apologizing that I am needed and I need to go back to the store as soon as possible. My boss's boss also sent my boss, who was already at home, to help sort the mess out. Hearing him apologize to the backroom manager was gold. Next story. Please divert to the nearest hospital. Okay. This story is not high stakes, but it amused me at the time. I used to work on an ambulance. My partner and I had been called to pick up an older guy with severe dementia. He was non-responsive at baseline because his labs were low or something. Since he was a vet, he needed to go to the veterans hospital. No big deal. We go get him and head off towards the hospital. This was definitely not an emergency, but I was doing my due diligence. Is he alert? Nope. Are his vitals normal? Not really, but he's old and this is his normal according to the paperwork. Any new issues? None. And then the kicker, is he having a stroke? Spoiler alert, no. To check this, we use the FAST acronym. Face, is his face drooping on one side? Arms, is he noticeably weaker on one side? Speech, is his speech slurred? Time, if these answers are yes, then get to the hospital as soon as possible. This dude had 0 symptoms of a stroke. He also couldn't understand what I was saying to him due to the dementia. At worst, one hand twitched when I asked him to squeeze, but it was a random muscle twitch. So I call up the hospital and give my report to the triage nurse. When I mention the twitch, she suddenly cuts me off and tells me I have to divert to the nearest hospital, then she hangs up on me. I check my GPS. They are the nearest hospital. Your wish is my command, nurse lady. When we pull in, the ER staff was a little confused. We took the patient into a room and as the doctors and nurses ran around looking like fools, a different nurse came in and asked what was going on. I explained it was a simple, non-emergency visit because the patient's lab results were low. I heard a snide voice in the background saying that's the stroke patient I'd averted. I clarified to the nurse that the patient was definitely not having a stroke. I explained my reasoning. I showed her the paperwork that proved this was his baseline, and she even redid the fast test to confirm. She agreed with me completely, giving a look towards a seat that was suddenly and mysteriously empty. The patient was able to get the appropriate care at the appropriate facility, and hopefully the nurse would be more likely to listen longer in the future. Next story. You should think about what you want. Okay. I used to be a firefighter for a volunteer department. The town was small and nothing happened on most days. But I was young and single and I loved the job. I showed up every single time I could. The only person who was there more than me was the chief. As many volunteer firefighters know, when grandma falls down at 3 a.m., you get 1 or 2 people. But if there's a fire? People you haven't seen in months suddenly have enough time to show up. Anyway, that department was a mess. People were always crap-talking and backstabbing. Training was a joke. You were lucky to get a PowerPoint once a week. Stuff was stolen often. There was once a whole political coup for some reason. Somebody really wanted power in a small town department in the middle of nowhere. I learned it was best to just stay quiet and do my job, and that was helped when I went to night shifts at my real job. I was working 12+ hour shifts, sometimes 5 or 6 days a week. I still showed up to every run I could, but after 7 years there, I was just done with it all. Everything came to a head when I was scheduled 28 12-hour shifts out of a 30-day month. I was still the second most active member out of 30 people, but I wasn't kissing the appropriate asses, and the management kept trying to get me in trouble. They once threatened to fire me for not turning in some paperwork, and I had to point out that paperwork had been sitting in their mailbox for 3 days. They eventually decided to add a stupid new rule. You were now required to sit at the station for 40 unpaid hours a month. Not doing so could lead to discipline and termination. I didn't bother. I was about 24 shifts into the month and I did not care about their dumb rule. But I realized that I could make it, so I left work, grabbed a change of clothes, and I went to the department. It was about noon, which was midnight to me since I worked nights. I tried to sleep on the rock-hard beds they provided. Not 30 minutes went by when the training officer kicked the door in and demanded that I get up and help with training. My role? I sat on a hose so it didn't move while somebody else practiced the pump controls. A sandbag could have done just as well. An hour later, training finished and I tried to go back to sleep. I was told off again. I ended up hiding in the TV room so I could have some peace and quiet. They found me again and wrote me up, first time in years, for what amounted to not being enthusiastic enough about the job. I endured a lecture while trying not to fall asleep where I stood. I finally got to go sit down when I got a text from the boss at my real job. They wanted me to work that night and wondered if I was available. I thought, you know what? I am available. And I left. A few days later, I got a nasty email from one of the guys who wrote me up, telling me they didn't like my attitude and that I needed to think about what I wanted. I thought about it and I realized I didn't want to deal with their crap anymore. So I wrote my resignation letter, went back to the station, gathered my personal effects, and I never went back. I hope you guys like this video. If you did, make sure like, comment, share and subscribe the channel or posts.